So, King Charles had reportedly been confronted with duchy transfer records allegedly connected to Queen Camilla, and for several moments, the king appeared completely frozen. What made the records so unsettling was not simply the possibility of money changing hands, but the suggestion that arrangements surrounding the Duchy of Cornwall may have been made without the full knowledge of the future heir. For Charles, the discovery raised a deeply personal question. For William, it raised something far more consequential. Who knew what had been signed, and why had no one told him? Before we go any further, subscribe so you do not miss the next royal investigation. Because behind every carefully managed palace statement, there may be another detail the headlines never explain. To understand why these records could matter so much, we have to go back to the private discussions that allegedly took place long before anyone outside the royal machinery knew there was a problem. What appeared to be ordinary planning may have established a boundary that someone later crossed. And that is where this story begins. King Charles did not immediately speak. The alleged duchy transfer records were sitting in front of him, and for a moment, the room seemed to become unusually quiet. The papers themselves were unremarkable. Administrative documents, dates, authorizations, names, and descriptions of arrangements that, individually, might have appeared routine. But taken together, they appeared to raise a question far more serious than an ordinary financial disagreement. Why was Camilla's name connected to arrangements involving an estate so closely associated with the heir to the throne? The Duchy of Cornwall is not simply another royal property portfolio. Its history, purpose, and constitutional significance are tied directly to the position of the Prince of Wales. When Charles became king, the duchy passed to William as part of the established succession. That transition was supposed to be orderly, automatic, and largely invisible. Yet the alleged records suggested that there may have been exceptions. That was what made the moment so uncomfortable. Charles had spent decades learning how the monarchy protects itself through procedure. Every document has a route. Every authorization has a signature. Every major decision leaves some form of institutional trace. And now, according to the scenario surrounding these records, those traces appeared to point toward arrangements connected to his wife. The immediate question was whether anything improper had actually occurred. That would ultimately be a matter for legal and financial review. But another question was already more difficult to dismiss. Who had known about the arrangements when they were being made? Charles reportedly did not summon Camilla immediately. Instead, his attention turned towards something far more revealing: the official schedules and records surrounding the period in question. If the documents contain dates, then those dates could be compared with meetings, audiences, private briefings, and decisions made inside the royal household. A financial record could show what happened. A calendar might reveal when it happened. And together they could begin to show who might have been present when the decisions were discussed. That distinction mattered enormously. Because if Charles had known, the story could become one about judgment and responsibility. If he had not known, then the question became even more unsettling. Had people inside the royal machinery been making decisions beyond the understanding of the king himself? William soon became part of that question. The Prince of Wales was reportedly briefed through his own household rather than directly by either Charles or Camilla. His reaction was described not as anger, but as precision. He wanted the original records. He wanted the dates. Most importantly, he wanted the names attached to the decisions. Then came the question that reportedly changed the atmosphere of the briefing. Who knew? No immediate answer followed. And in a monarchy where silence is often carefully managed, that silence could not simply be dismissed. Because the deeper this alleged paper trail went, the less it looked like a question about money, and the more it began to resemble a question about inheritance, authority, and trust. For Charles, the alleged records created a problem that could not be solved simply by proving whether a particular transfer was lawful. The deeper problem was trust. A king can survive criticism. A monarch can survive an unpopular decision. Even a royal family can endure public disagreement. But the suggestion that important decisions may have been made inside the royal machinery without the sovereign fully understanding them strikes at something far more personal. The belief that the person wearing the crown remains in control of his own house. And that was why the discovery affected Charles differently from everyone else. For Camilla, the danger was equally personal, but in another way. Her position within the monarchy had been built over decades of extraordinary public scrutiny. Whatever people thought of her past, she had gradually established herself as a working member of the royal family and eventually as Queen Consort. That transformation depended heavily on one quality: restraint. She rarely appeared to be reaching for influence. She rarely challenged the institution publicly. She allowed time, duty, and familiarity to reshape public opinion. Now, however, the alleged records created an uncomfortable possibility. If arrangements connected to the duchy had benefited her, critics could interpret that as evidence of influence behind closed doors. If she had not known what the documents meant, then another possibility emerged. Perhaps advisors had been making decisions around her without explaining their full consequences. Neither interpretation was comfortable, and William faced a different kind of anxiety altogether. He was not simply the king's son. He was the future king and the current Prince of Wales, the person whose position was directly connected to the duchy itself. For him, the issue was therefore not merely what had happened during his father's reign. It was what precedent might be left behind. Every unusual arrangement created inside one reign can become a precedent for the next. Every exception that goes unchallenged can eventually look like a rule. And William would eventually inherit not only the crown but the institutional habits created before him. That was why his reported response was so controlled. Rather than making accusations, he wanted documents, original documents, dates, authorizations, names. He wanted to understand the process before judging the people involved. Inside the royal households, however, the atmosphere was changing. Conversations became more cautious. Officials who normally moved easily between different offices began choosing their words more carefully. Routine decisions suddenly seemed capable of carrying another meaning. A delayed meeting could be interpreted as deliberate. A changed schedule could look like a message. A missing name could become a question. Nothing had been publicly proven, yet the emotional consequences were already beginning. Charles was facing the possibility that his judgment would be questioned. Camilla was facing renewed scrutiny over how much influence she actually possessed. William was confronting the uncomfortable realization that the machinery surrounding his future inheritance might contain decisions he had never fully seen. But none of them yet understood how this had really begun. Because years earlier, behind closed doors, the monarchy had already confronted the very question that was now returning in the form of a paper trail. And someone, somewhere, had apparently decided that the matter was not finished after all. Long before the alleged transfer records reached public attention, there was reportedly a much quieter conversation taking place inside the royal machinery. It was not a confrontation. It was not a scandal. It was a planning discussion about the future. Charles was king, Camilla was his queen, and senior officials were considering the practical questions that every monarchy must eventually face. What would happen to the queen consort if she survived the king? Where would she live? How would her household be supported? What arrangements would protect her position after a change of reign? These were not unreasonable questions. In fact, they were precisely the sort of questions the institution was expected to consider long before they became urgent. But according to the scenario surrounding the disputed records, the conversation eventually reached a more sensitive subject: the Duchy of Cornwall. That was where an important boundary was allegedly established. The duchy was not simply another asset controlled according to personal preference. Its traditional purpose was tied to the heir to the throne. When the monarch changes, the duchy moves with the position of the Prince of Wales. The distinction mattered. Camilla could have a secure future without becoming a beneficiary of an estate whose constitutional purpose was connected to the heir. At least, that was reportedly the understanding inside the meeting. Someone in the room allegedly made the position clear. Arrangements for the queen could be made, but the duchy itself was not supposed to become a vehicle for those arrangements. The discussion appeared to end there. No confrontation followed. No dramatic announcement was made. The matter simply disappeared back into the machinery of royal administration. And that may have been the most important detail of all. Because institutions rarely remember conversations in the same way people do, a verbal warning can disappear into minutes, summaries, and later interpretations. A boundary that seems obvious to one generation can become strangely flexible in another. Years later, the alleged records would raise precisely that possibility. If the duchy had once been identified as a boundary, why did arrangements connected to Camilla allegedly appear in documents that seemed to cross into that territory? There were several possible explanations. Perhaps the later instruments were entirely legitimate and had simply been misunderstood. Perhaps officials interpreted the earlier restriction differently. Perhaps the arrangements were made for reasons that had nothing to do with Camilla personally. Or perhaps the boundary had been understood clearly and then gradually circumvented through a series of administrative decisions that looked harmless when viewed separately. That final possibility was the one that made the paper trail so difficult to ignore. Because a deliberate breach would be easy to identify, a single secret transaction would have a beginning, an author, and a purpose. But what if nobody had ever signed a document saying, "This is what we are doing"? What if the outcome had emerged slowly through a chain of small decisions that no individual person believed was significant? That was the question waiting inside the records. And when the documents were finally examined together, the story changed. Because what appeared to be one controversial transfer may have been something much more complicated, something built piece by piece. Something that had never needed one dramatic signature. What could not be done openly, it now appeared, may have been accomplished quietly through the administrative machinery itself. The first document did not necessarily look alarming. Neither did the second. That was precisely what made the alleged paper trail so difficult to interpret. A single administrative adjustment could have an ordinary explanation. A revised authorization could reflect a change in circumstances. A beneficiary designation could be corrected by officials who believed they were simply following established procedures. But when the documents were placed beside one another, a different possibility began to emerge. The question was no longer whether one transfer had been made. It was whether a series of individually explainable decisions had gradually produced an outcome that had once been considered off-limits. That distinction changed everything. The alleged records appeared to contain several layers of administrative movement. Adjustments to arrangements, changes in how benefits were described, and decisions that seemed insignificant when viewed separately. None of them, by itself, necessarily proved wrongdoing. Together, however, they created a pattern. And patterns are often more difficult for institutions to explain than individual decisions. This was the moment when the story stopped being simply about Camilla. If the arrangements had been deliberately created for her, the central question became who authorized them and why. If they had emerged through ordinary administration, then the institution had another problem. How could such a significant cumulative outcome develop without anyone recognizing the constitutional implications? There was an even more uncomfortable possibility. Perhaps different people had known different pieces of the story. One official understood the financial arrangement. Another understood the constitutional restriction. Someone else approved the paperwork. And somewhere between those separate responsibilities, nobody was looking at the complete picture. That possibility offered no simple villain. It suggested something potentially more dangerous, a system capable of producing a major consequence without a single person accepting full responsibility for it. For William, that interpretation was particularly important. The Prince of Wales did not need to prove that someone had intentionally acted against him. He needed to understand whether the information he had received about the duchy's position was complete. If it was not, then the problem reached beyond Camilla. It reached into the process by which the future king was being prepared to inherit, and that was the revelation that forced everyone to reconsider the earlier meeting. The boundary discussed behind closed doors had apparently not disappeared. It had become blurred. What looked at first like a hidden benefit now appeared, at least within this alleged scenario, to be the possible result of multiple decisions accumulating over time. That made the question of motive almost impossible to answer. Was someone deliberately bypassing a restriction? Were officials simply interpreting complicated rules differently? Or had the monarchy created such a complicated administrative structure that responsibility itself had become almost impossible to trace? Charles now faced the most difficult possibility of all. The records might not prove that Camilla had ordered anything. They might not even prove that Charles had authorized anything. but they could still reveal that the system surrounding them had allowed something to happen without clear, shared understanding. And suddenly, the question was no longer simply, who received the benefit? It was far more dangerous, who understood the entire arrangement while it was happening? Because if nobody could answer that question, Parliament would have a reason to look beyond the family and toward the institution itself. Once Parliament entered the picture, the alleged dispute could no longer remain a private matter inside the royal household. The question had changed. It was no longer simply whether Camilla had benefited from arrangements connected to the duchy. It was whether the machinery responsible for managing those arrangements had operated with sufficient transparency, and whether the people ultimately responsible for the institution had been properly informed. That distinction was crucial. The duchy occupies an unusual position. Its administration involves property, income, and established legal arrangements, yet its significance is inseparable from the constitutional role of the Prince of Wales. That creates a complicated boundary between private administration and public responsibility. And whenever that boundary becomes unclear, oversight becomes unavoidable. Inside the royal household, the response was reportedly cautious. Private secretaries began reviewing correspondence. Legal advisors examined the wording of the disputed instruments. Officials involved with the duchy were asked to establish exactly how each arrangement had moved through the system. Nobody wanted to describe the situation as a crisis, but the machinery was already behaving as though one had begun. The most sensitive issue was not whether individual documents could be defended, it was whether the complete sequence could be defended. That meant going back through the records one by one. Who requested an amendment? Who approved it? Who was informed? Who received the final version? And, perhaps most importantly, what information reached William when responsibility for the duchy passed into his hands? That last question reportedly became a particular concern inside the Prince of Wales's household. William's team began examining the material independently. The approach was deliberately procedural. There were no public accusations and no dramatic confrontation. They wanted primary documents rather than summaries. The difference mattered. A summary tells an heir what officials believe is important. An original document shows what was actually signed, and according to the scenario surrounding these records, the comparison raised discrepancies between what William had been told and what some of the underlying instruments appeared to show. That did not automatically establish wrongdoing, but it created a new problem. If the records were accurate, why had the full picture not been included in the earlier briefings? The palace now faced competing pressures. Protect Camilla from an allegation that might ultimately prove administrative or innocent. Protect Charles from the appearance that he had lost control of his own household. Protect William from inheriting an unresolved institutional problem. And protect the monarchy from the far more damaging perception that its internal rules applied differently depending on who was involved. The institution responded in the language it understood best. Procedure. Meetings multiplied. Reviews were commissioned. Access to certain records became more restricted. Officials who normally handled matters informally were suddenly required to document every step. The machinery was tightening around itself. But there was one problem no procedure could solve. Eventually, Charles would have to confront Camilla directly. Because regardless of what the records proved, there was one question that could not be answered by a lawyer, an advisor, or a committee. Did she know what was being done in her name? And that question was about to be asked behind closed doors. The confrontation, if it happened, was unlikely to resemble the dramatic scenes imagined by the public. There were no cameras, no raised voices, no carefully prepared statement. Only Charles, Camilla, and the weight of a folder that had already changed the atmosphere around them. By this point, the king had reportedly seen enough of the alleged records to understand that the issue could not simply be dismissed as an administrative misunderstanding. He needed to know what Camilla understood about the arrangements connected to her. So he asked the question directly. Did you know what was being done in your name? For Camilla, there was no easy answer. A direct admission would carry obvious consequences. A complete denial could raise another problem if documents later suggested that she had been more closely involved than claimed. The most defensible position was also the most complicated one. She could have trusted advisors to manage the details of her affairs without understanding the wider constitutional implications of what they were signing or arranging. That explanation was entirely possible. Senior members of the royal family deal with an enormous volume of official paperwork. They rely on private secretaries, lawyers, financial advisors, and household officials to determine which documents require detailed attention, but that defense contained an uncomfortable weakness. Trust in advisors does not eliminate responsibility. And if the arrangements had gradually produced an outcome that crossed an established boundary, someone had to explain how that happened. Charles reportedly listened without immediately responding. The emotional tension came not from accusation but from uncertainty. For years, his relationship with Camilla had survived intense public scrutiny. Their marriage had become one of the central personal stories of his life and eventually part of the public architecture of his reign. Now the alleged records had placed that relationship inside an institutional question. Charles was no longer asking only whether Camilla had done something wrong. He was asking whether he had failed to see something happening around her. That distinction was devastating, because if Camilla had been unaware, then the systems surrounding her had failed. If she had known, then Charles had to confront a deeply personal breach of trust. And if neither of them had understood the full pattern, then the institution itself had become the problem. The conversation therefore had no simple resolution. Whatever was said privately could not erase the documents. Charles's response was reportedly procedural rather than emotional. A deeper review would be required. Existing authorizations connected to the disputed arrangements could not simply continue while the records remained under examination. That decision carried an unmistakable message. No matter what Camilla knew, the system would no longer rely solely on assumptions. The king was effectively placing institutional distance between the queen and the disputed machinery, but the consequences went further. Access is one of the most important forms of power inside a royal household. It determines who receives information, who attends meetings, whose advice reaches the sovereign, and whose decisions move through the system without resistance. Quietly changing access can therefore be more consequential than publicly removing a title. And as the review expanded, Camilla's position within that machinery began to change. Nothing dramatic was announced. Nothing was publicly declared, but doors that had once opened automatically now required another key, and the next person watching those changes was William. Because he had reached a conclusion of his own. If trust had failed once, he wanted a system that could function without depending entirely upon it. William did not respond to the growing controversy with anger. He responded with paperwork. That distinction mattered because the Prince of Wales understood something his father had spent decades learning. Institutions rarely change because someone becomes emotional. They change when a procedure is written down and made difficult to reverse. By now, William had reportedly reviewed enough of the alleged records to understand that the problem extended beyond Camilla. He needed to know what had happened when responsibility for the duchy had moved from Charles to him. What had he been told? What had he not been told? And were the documents now under review consistent with the information his office had received? Those questions were not accusations. They were preparation. William was preparing for a future in which every decision surrounding the crown would eventually become his responsibility. That made the alleged discrepancies particularly uncomfortable. If an arrangement could be created during one reign, survive through administrative channels, and only later become visible to the next heir, then the problem was not simply personal. It was structural. The future king could not afford to inherit uncertainty. So William reportedly requested the original instruments rather than relying on summaries prepared by officials. He wanted dates. He wanted signatures. He wanted correspondence. He wanted to know which offices had handled each stage and who had been informed before decisions were finalized. The approach was remarkably restrained. There was no public accusation against Charles. No direct attack on Camilla. No attempt to turn a private family problem into a spectacle. Instead, William allowed the documents to speak. That silence may have been more powerful than any statement. Eventually, however, the tension between father and son could not remain entirely procedural. A private conversation became necessary. Charles understood what William was asking for. It was not simply access to information. It was assurance. William needed to know that when the duchy formed part of his inheritance, nothing connected to it could again be altered without his office understanding exactly what was happening. The conversation therefore carried an emotional weight neither man could easily escape. Charles was still William's father. William was still Charles's son. But the roles were no longer equal in emotional terms. One was looking backward at decisions already made. The other was looking forward at consequences he might one day have to inherit. William did not need to accuse his father of deliberately misleading him. The more painful question was simpler. Why had he not been told? There was no answer that could completely repair that moment. So the solution became institutional. Any future arrangement touching the duchy or the settled interests of the heir would require direct involvement from the Prince of Wales's office. On paper, it was merely a procedural safeguard. In reality, it represented something much larger. It meant that the future heir would no longer have to depend entirely upon the assumption that everyone inside the royal machinery understood the same thing. The boundary had been written down, and once written down, it could no longer be quietly interpreted away. But the palace still had one problem. The public knew something had changed. And soon, the question would no longer be what William had demanded privately. It would be why the monarchy had suddenly found it necessary to create a rule that should never have been needed in the first place. The palace could control access. It could control schedules. It could control the wording of official statements. But it could not control a story once the public had begun connecting the pieces. The first reports were cautious. There was no dramatic accusation, no declaration of wrongdoing, and no definitive explanation of what the alleged duchy records actually meant. Instead, the language was restrained. Questions had been raised. Documents were being reviewed. Officials were examining arrangements connected to the estate. The palace declined to comment. Those words might have sounded insignificant to anyone unfamiliar with royal communications. Inside the world of monarchy, they carried a different weight. Silence does not necessarily confirm an allegation. But silence invites interpretation. Soon, commentators began dividing into competing camps. Some argued that the documents could simply reflect complicated estate administration. Royal finances are surrounded by layers of legal, constitutional, and historical arrangements, and a document that looks unusual to the public may have an entirely ordinary explanation. Others focused on something else: transparency. Their argument was that even if every arrangement was technically permissible, the public had a legitimate reason to ask why the full picture had not been easier to understand. That distinction changed the public conversation. The story was no longer simply about whether Camilla had received a benefit. It became a question about whether the monarchy had been sufficiently transparent about how that benefit was created, authorized, or recorded. And that was far more damaging to Charles's public image. He had spent much of his reign presenting himself as a modernizer, a more streamlined monarchy, a more disciplined institution, a system capable of adapting without losing its traditions. Now, the alleged controversy threatened to create the opposite impression: a complicated network of private arrangements operating behind formal public responsibilities. For Camilla, the renewed scrutiny was deeply uncomfortable. Supporters argued that there was no evidence she had personally designed or authorized improper arrangements. Critics argued that her position made the question of influence impossible to ignore. Neither side could completely settle the matter. William remained publicly silent. That silence became another story. Every appearance was examined for signs of tension. Every photograph was interpreted. Every change in scheduling became another possible clue. The palace continued to emphasize continuity, but continuity itself had become part of the problem, because if nothing had changed, why had new safeguards been introduced? And if something had changed, why was nobody explaining exactly what? The public was now doing what institutions fear most. It was filling gaps. One commentator focused on the alleged financial arrangements, another focused on constitutional precedent, another focused on the relationship between Charles and William. And soon, the entire controversy had become larger than the original records. It had become a debate about trust in the monarchy itself. For Charles, that was the cruelest development. The controversy was beginning to touch the very image he had spent his reign trying to construct. Not an extravagant royal household, not a careless institution, but a monarchy that understood its responsibilities. Now, every unexplained document appeared to challenge that promise. Yet the most revealing moment was still ahead. Because the public would eventually see Charles, Camilla, and William together again, nothing would be said about the records. Nothing would be explained. And yet, in the way they appeared beside one another, viewers would begin searching for an answer that no official statement could provide. Had the family actually moved past the crisis? Or had the rules changed because the trust between them already had? The public appearance looked ordinary. That was precisely why people began watching it so closely. Charles arrived as expected. Camilla followed the established rhythm of the engagement. William maintained the composed expression that had become almost instinctive whenever cameras were present. There was no confrontation, no visible disagreement, no carefully staged moment designed to answer the questions surrounding the alleged duchy records. And yet, after everything that had happened behind closed doors, the smallest details suddenly seemed to matter. The distance between them, who walked beside whom, who spoke first, who waited, who appeared to receive information directly from the king. In ordinary circumstances, these details would have meant almost nothing. After a controversy involving trust, authority, and the future inheritance, they could be interpreted very differently. Charles appeared controlled. That was expected. A monarch cannot allow private uncertainty to become public instability. Camilla remained composed as well. Her public strength had always depended upon the ability to continue performing her duties regardless of what was being discussed beyond the cameras. William was equally disciplined. He smiled. He greeted people. He followed the formal rhythm of the occasion. But there was something different about the meaning of his presence. He was no longer simply the king's son standing beside his father. He was the heir whose office had now reportedly gained greater visibility into the machinery surrounding the duchy. The distinction was subtle, and that was exactly what made it powerful. Nothing in the public appearance confirmed the allegations. Nothing proved that Camilla had known about the disputed arrangements. Nothing demonstrated that Charles had deliberately concealed anything from William. The photographs could establish none of those things. What they could show was something simpler. The institution was still functioning. The king was still king. The queen was still performing her duties. The heir was still preparing for the future. The monarchy had not collapsed. But survival and restoration are not the same thing. Behind the ceremony, new procedures were reportedly being put into place. The old assumption that trust alone was sufficient had been replaced by documentation, oversight, and formal involvement. That change would never be visible in a photograph. Yet it was arguably more important than anything the cameras captured. Because institutions reveal their deepest fears through the safeguards they create, a monarchy does not normally write rules against imaginary problems. If a new boundary was necessary, then something had happened to make the old boundary feel insufficient. And that was what the audience was now being asked to understand. The public image showed continuity. The private machinery suggested adaptation. Charles and Camilla could stand together without publicly resolving every question. William could remain respectful without pretending that nothing had changed. Both things could be true at once. Perhaps that was the most revealing part of the entire episode. There was no dramatic ending, no public rupture, no family member walking away. Instead, there was something far more characteristic of the monarchy: silence. The kind of silence that allows an institution to survive while leaving the audience to wonder what has been permanently altered beneath the surface. From a distance, everything still looked normal. But behind that image, the rules governing the future were no longer quite the same, and that left one final question. If the monarchy had survived the controversy, what exactly had it lost in the process? In the end, the most important consequence was not a transfer, a document, or even a parliamentary question. It was trust. Whatever the alleged records ultimately proved, the controversy had forced the royal household to confront something it had spent generations trying to avoid. The possibility that its own internal machinery could become complicated enough for responsibility to disappear between offices, advisors, and signatures. For Charles, that was perhaps the most painful consequence. He had spent his life preparing to become king. He understood the importance of procedure, continuity, and institutional discipline, yet the controversy placed him in an uncomfortable position. If he had known about the disputed arrangements, questions would naturally follow about his judgment. If he had not known, questions would follow about the people operating around him. Neither possibility was comfortable for a monarch whose authority depends heavily on appearing informed and in control. Camilla faced a different kind of consequence. Her position within the monarchy did not necessarily disappear, and nothing in the alleged records alone could establish that she personally designed or authorized improper arrangements. But suspicion has its own permanence. After years spent rebuilding public acceptance, she would once again have to live with questions about influence, access, and the boundaries of her role. Her greatest strength remained the same as before: silence. She could continue appearing at engagements, performing duties, and refusing to turn a private institutional dispute into a public family argument. William emerged differently. He did not gain power through confrontation. He gained something more important: visibility. The future king now had a clearer boundary around the institution he would eventually inherit. If arrangements touching the duchy required direct involvement from his office, then the lesson had been written into procedure. The heir would not have to rely entirely on trust. That may sound administrative, but in a monarchy, administrative language can carry enormous emotional meaning. A rule requiring transparency exists because someone has learned the cost of its absence. And that was the deeper transformation. The monarchy had survived. The family had remained publicly united. The king continued to reign. The queen continued to serve. The heir continued to prepare. From the outside, continuity had been preserved. But continuity is not the same as certainty. Something had changed beneath the surface. The institution had become more careful. The relationships had become more guarded. And the assumption that everyone inside the system automatically understood and trusted the same process had been weakened. That is why the alleged folder mattered so much. Not because paper itself has power, but because paper creates memory. A conversation can be forgotten. A recollection can be disputed. A private promise can be interpreted differently by the people who heard it. A document remains. And when enough documents begin pointing toward the same unresolved question, even a monarchy built on tradition has to stop and look. Perhaps that was the real lesson. Power is not ultimately preserved by crowns, titles, or ancient buildings. It is preserved by trust. Trust between husband and wife. Trust between father and son. Trust between an institution and the heir who will inherit it. And trust between the monarchy and the public that continues to grant it legitimacy. The records may eventually be explained. The procedures may be corrected. The public attention will eventually move elsewhere. But the people inside that room will remember what the documents forced them to confront. A crown can survive a scandal. A record can be corrected. A family can remain standing. But when a dynasty begins auditing its own trust, the silence inside the room becomes the story.